My house was built in 1904. It's a single family home, wood frame setting on a concrete block foundation. I've been living here for about 12 years. Of all the weird things that my siblings and me have seen or heard in this house, this one event is my favourite. This happened to my brother. About 10 years ago, he and his best friends had started a garage band playing mostly Spanish rock, alternative music but in Spanish. His friends could only get together on Sunday afternoons, and they would practice into the early evening. They would usually call it quits about 8 PM. This was the time I usually showed up and went to bed, cause I worked the graveyard shift. This happened in late fall, so the days were getting shorter. They had just finished a long session when the decision to head to someone else's house came about. My brother handed his car keys to his buddy so they could load up the equipment. Everyone had filed out of the basement, but the tricky part was they needed to walk all the way to the back of the basement, up the back stairs, through the kitchen doorway down the hall into the living room, and out into the front porch. Everyone was outside, sitting in my brother's truck waiting for him. My brother was walking up the back stairs when he remembered that he had left his pancakes in a to-go container sitting on a speaker in the basement. He made the decision to go back. Now, the basement isn't clean, with full sight lines. There'd been partitions made and the boiler and main heating unit are right smack in the middle. So after my brother walks back, he's about to go get his food container when out of the corner of his eye, he sees it. It's a shadowy figure, right at his peripheral vision. This feeling of dread and uneasiness washed over my brother. We'd been taught that if you were ever in the presence of a spirit or ghost and you felt a bad vibe, to say a quick prayer or to cuss at it. My brother chose the latter. He just basically told it, "Hey, fuck you, I don't have time for this shit." My brother started to walk to the back of the basement and briskly up the stairs, closing doors and turning off lights as he was walking out. The last switch is on the opposite side of the front door. Luckily the door was open and the light from the street lamp was flooding through the living room with its amber light. My brother said he felt something at his back, but at no point did he turn around. As he flicked the last switch in the living room, it went dark, as the rest of the house did. As he stepped out, he pulled on the door, closing it behind him, and still holding his food container in one hand, he jogged down the few porch steps. Then he walked towards the front gate. Our house resides far from the main street, essentially having a large front yard but no rear garage. As he closed the gap between himself and his friend-laden truck, he kinda smiled and thought things over in his head, mad at himself for spooking out when there was no reason to. He climbed into the driver's side of the truck, putting on his seatbelt and getting ready to pull out of the parking spot directly in front of the house when one of his friends asked, "Hey, what about your brother? Isn't he coming with us?" My brother answered, "What do you mean? He went to work early tonight. He's already gone. Do you see his car anywhere?" The next question they asked still terrifies him and me till this day. "So then who was walking behind you when you were leaving the house?" In my old house, I would be sitting on my computer, listening to music on my iPod while playing World of Warcraft. Periodically, the screen would flicker and my iPod's volume would either adjust up or down. I never thought anything of it at the time, until it continued to do so only in that house. Eventually, I just said, whatever. If it likes the song, it likes the song. However, inside this house, I had constant issues. One of which would be my sleeping in bed or living room depending on the night and waking up to a low grumbling sound. Feeling fear struck my heart, and listening to the beat of my now panicked state, I would try and move to wake up and see what was happening. I couldn't. Not even my fingertips would move. Completely conscious and able to see silhouettes, I could see and hear my cat hiss, and I can feel myself being moved as light shines over my eyes, and I fall asleep again. In this particular instance, I remember waking up and seeing a man standing on this 100-foot tree in my backyard. A real tall, slender guy. I muster up as much strength as I can, raise up my hand and give this guy the finger, after which I immediately fall back asleep with a thud. I hear my back door open on the second floor and my dogs start barking and whining from the downstairs. I was 16 and 250 pounds. No one was moving me anywhere, realistically speaking, of course. Anyways, to this day, I swear that this thing was an extraterrestrial, or a ghost, because I saw it multiple times throughout my life. Once standing in the kitchen window, which was 8 feet off the ground. That particular night, and in the first house I ever lived, I used to see him in my bedroom window, and he would talk to me. It ended when I moved out of the last house. I'm now 21. During Hurricane Gustav in 2008, I evacuated to a church in Baton Rouge with a friend and his family. At the same time, there was an entire nursing home's worth of old people staying in the church too. My friend, his family, and me all shared one room together. In this church, there was one bathroom that was large, similar to something that would be in an elementary school, a few stalls, a trail urinal, etc. So one night during the storm, my friend and I made a trip to the bathroom. The lights had gone out since being in the middle of a hurricane and all. The church had a musty, eerie feel to it, kind of like when you turn out the AC in a house for a few days. The area surrounding the church was also dead quiet since there was no electricity in the area. The bathroom was several halls over from our room, so we grabbed our flashlights and set out. While walking down one long hall, we shined our flashlights ahead and we got the biggest fright of our fucking lives. There at the end of the hall sat an old man in a wheelchair in the middle of the night with no one around. Now this hall was incredibly long, so we could make him out, but we couldn't really see all his facial features. Once we grasped what we saw, we turned and looked at each other, semi-freaked out. Then we shined our flashlights back to where he was, and there was nothing there. He was just fucking gone. No signs, no sound, nothing. Needless to say, we hauled ass back to our room. We just decided to piss out the window instead. Okay, this happened to me when I was a junior in high school. It was December and it had just started snowing that evening. My best friend and I were in debate and getting ready for our state qualifiers that were the next day. We were writing our cases and as usual, at each other's throats over the details of the cases. It was a stressful and tense evening. We finally finished our cases at about 3 AM, then we went to my room for the night. Almost as soon as we get into my room, we hear what sounds like the water turning on in the other end of the house. No big deal, probably my parents, I think. Then we hear the front door open. I told her, I bet my mum woke up and wanted some fresh air. It made sense. I really thought that's what it was. Until we heard incredibly heavy footsteps in my living room, headed for my room. They were not anyone in my family's footsteps. Then they stopped. My friend and I looked at each other and we both freaked out, just standing, frozen in my room. We walked closer to each other and the footsteps started again, but this time they were running towards us. We both flipped. We grabbed each other's hands out of fear and my bedroom door flew open. We both looked at the door. Nobody was there. We ran to the bedroom that's connected to my room. I closed and locked the door behind us and stood against it. We finally got the balls to do it. We sprinted to my parents' room, crying and hysterical. We startled my parents awake. They said neither of them had gotten up, but my dad grabbed his gun and looked outside. There were no tracks in the snow, anywhere around our house. My brother once lived in a flat in downtown Mount Clemens in Michigan. The Clem was known to be a hotspot for baths back in the Depression era and was booming with activity. Nowadays, it has some rundown parts, and this is where my brother rented his flat. It was a giant old raggedy house, which was now separated into multiple odd apartments. So long story short, he always admitted to odd experiences, such as cupboard doors opening up, things missing, but one peculiar oddity was that he always was missing boxes or underwear from his drawer. He admitted that he thought his house was haunted and that the ghost had a crush on him. Never anything violent or disturbing, just odd things. Later on, he starts dating his future ex-wife. She starts coming around, and he notices that the oddities begin to increase. New oddities began to occur. His girlfriend would always find her shoes, which were left on a mat inside the apartment, outside the door on the patio in the morning. She'd always comment to my brother to stop putting her shoes outside. He had an idea of why, but didn't want to frighten her. Besides, it wasn't hurting anyone, right? Well, things started getting worse. He comes home from work, and his girlfriend was staying there while he was gone, and claimed that the stove burner kept lighting itself. She'd walk into the kitchen, and it would be lit. She'd turn it off, and shortly later, it'd be lit again. Then one night, my brother wakes up in the middle of the night and sees his girlfriend sitting in the end of the bed. Not just sees, but feels her near his feet, staring at him. He calls out for her to come to bed, but she doesn't respond. He calls out louder, telling her to come to bed and asking what was wrong. His girlfriend then asks what he's doing. He turns and she's sleeping next to him. So he turns back, but no one is at the end of the bed. Now he's freaked out, but doesn't want to scare his girlfriend from coming over his place. Then a few nights later, they're both sleeping, and he wakes up to his girlfriend screaming. He looks over to see that she's sleeping, but she's thrashing around and holding onto her own neck. He doesn't see anything, so he starts yelling and shaking her to wake up. And after a few shakes, she wakes up crying and terrified. She starts telling my brother about how real her dream felt, that a woman was strangling her, telling her to get out, that she doesn't belong there, and to leave her man alone. Her neck had red marks on it, possibly from herself trying to defend herself, but they believed it to be from something else. My brother then came clean to her. They decided to do some research and find out that the address that they live in was an old brothel back in the day that the rich bathers used to stay in. My brother lived in that house for a few more weeks before he could locate to a new place, but his girlfriend never came back to stay the night, and he never experienced anything aggressive while there. My daughter was born with mild tracheomalacia, or soft windpipe. The only trouble it ever caused was that she would make a whistling sound sometimes when she was breathing, especially when she was excited or upset. Fast forward to when she was about 4 months old and fast asleep in her crib one evening. Her older brother had the stomach flu that day, and he had been throwing up. We thought the baby hadn't caught it, but after a little while after we put it to bed, we suddenly heard her softly sputtering on the monitor, then silence for a few seconds, then a huge loud wail, which made both my husband and I run even faster to her room. By the time we got to her, she had fallen eerily quiet again. We saw she was gasping for air, choking, unable to clear the vomit from her throat or get a clean breath. Even after we picked her up and cleared her mouth, she continued to gasp. She turned blue, then grey as I drove her quickly to the ER. She had partially recovered by the time we got there. They gave her O2, a chest x-ray, then a clean bill, and we left. Fast forward about 2 hours later when I'm back in my bedroom with her sleeping upright and a baby seat next to me on the bed. My husband and I talked briefly about what would have happened had the baby not cried out so loudly. Would we have reacted so quickly? Would she have recovered? I'm in and out of sleep because I kept checking on her. One of the times, just before I had fully awoken, I looked out in the hallway and saw my grandfather, who had passed away a few years prior. When he was alive, he was the most involved granddad ever. But when he met my husband, or my boyfriend at the time, they had an instant connection. When he passed away, his last coherent words were, "I'm not going to make it to Alchirius and Mr. Alchirius' wedding, am I?" He loved my husband dearly. So I see him out in the hall this night. He's just standing there in khakis and a polo with his hands in his pockets. In my dream state, I see all my children, except the baby, pulling at his arms, playing with him. He has a simple smile on his face. He looks over toward the baby's room and back at me and says, "I'm sorry for your loss." When we checked on the baby, she was blue and cold as ice. When I was younger and still living in Poland, a few friends and I took a trip and one night decided to stay at a bed and breakfast type place. Everything seemed normal until I suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. I felt some sort of presence behind me, so I slowly turned around, but there was no one there. I swear I could feel someone on the bed with me though, along with a slight shift in pressure on the bed. It went away after a few minutes and I went back to sleep. The next morning, I found out that a man had died in the bed about a week or so prior. When I was a child, I was scared of the dark. I swore to my mother I heard voices in it. They weren't evil, but they weren't familiar and they scared me. It was not uncommon in the middle of the night for me to wake up and hear whispers, as I would call them when asking my mum. She figured they were just bumps in the night and typically kids' nightmare material. I tried often to explain to her that it was more than that they sounded different from one another, the way people's voices do. On some nights, I would get so scared from these whispers that I would sleep in my mum's bed with her. It was an added bonus that the bathroom was directly outside of a bedroom door for my late night tinkles. I should add that at this point, when walking out into the hall to go to the bathroom, you look directly down the stairs that would lead you into the living room on the first floor. My mum's bedroom was on the second floor. On one such night around Christmas, I awoke and felt the need to relieve myself. I walked out from the door and distinctly heard the phrase, "Look," and to my astonishment, a red light, almost like a spotlight, was cast upon the wall at the very bottom of the stairs. The light had no other source, it was by itself, and I was transfixed by it. Being a little kid, and it only being a few days from Christmas, I knew what the light was. It was Santa! How else would he get into my house and know I was being a good boy? I was so excited and began walking down the stairs to greet him, picking up my pace after the second step as I began to creep off the wall and fade into the darkness in my living room. And that's when I heard him. A very strong, masculine voice. Different from the first. Not at all like my father's. It said, "Stop right now. Go back up those stairs." I listened, turned around, and what happened next, I'm not sure if I would believe if someone had told me this same story. After reaching the top of the stairs, I heard a very loud crash that sent me running back to my mother's bed, where I jumped straight under the covers and stayed there the whole night. When we awoke the next morning, the poinsettia lights my mother had put on the railing down the stairs were pulled straight down to the bottom of the stairs, some broken from what seemed like a forceful tear, laying in a single pile. The dry sink in my living room had fallen from the wall. My mum couldn't explain it. My father was worried that we'd been victims of a home invasion. My sister was crying. There was nothing missing. Nobody had broken in. There didn't seem to be any reason for this to have happened. And then I saw it, and I kept quiet about it because I was so afraid that I couldn't force words out of my mouth. There on the edge of the wooden dry sink, which had been facing up, were 3 indentations where the finish on the wood had been worn, almost as if in a forceful grip. Something down there had grabbed it and threw it down. That's what the bang was! I was mortified. And after that day, I never heard a single voice again. A few years back, I was camping in Lake Havasu with my brother and a few friends. My brother and I were working on building a fire while the other guys were on the boat, mooring it to the shore. We had a hole we dug where we had our previous fires that trip, so my brother and I got the fire going and sat around that pit. The fire was burning for a good 10 minutes and was at a decent size before the most bizarre thing happened. The fire just went out. Completely extinguished, as in no more flames. The embers were still emitting heat, but the actual flame was gone. My brother and I looked at each other, then back at the fire pit. A few seconds go by, then the fire reignites to the level it was at before it went out. At this point, we were totally confused, and then we just started screaming for the guys to come and check out what had happened. I was a junior in college and was living in a dorm which had a reputation of being haunted. Of course, The RA spread this around, and we had a fun time scaring ourselves for the first month or so of school. The floors which had the greatest reputation of being haunted were the 2nd and 5th floors. My room was on the 5th. I lived on the international floor, even though I myself was not international, so my roommate was from Tokyo. In this dorm, each floor alternated between a single, a bathroom, and a double, so 3 people would share a bathroom basically. This setup was called a suite, and the person who lived in the single, or the double if you were the single, were called your suite mates. My suite mate was from Cairo. So I come home at about midnight after a long night of chatting online, and my roommate has the curtain shut between our halves of the room. She hears me walk in and says, "Oh, Jane, I'm so glad you're here. While I was in the bathroom, the door opened by itself." Now, I enjoy a mystery as much as anyone, but I like to be practical about things, so naturally I think there's a rational explanation. I walk into the bathroom. The curtain over the bathroom is drawn closed, so I peek under it. Sure enough, the window is open about an inch. I figured it must have been a draft. Then I walk back out into the room and tell my roommate, "Well, the window's open about an inch, so it probably just blew the door open." My roommate is greatly relieved and says something to the effect of, "Whew, I'm so glad to hear that." Total time transpired? About 20 seconds. I turn around and go back into the bathroom so I can take my contacts out and brush my teeth, and I stop dead in my tracks. The curtain, which had previously been closed, was now open. But it wasn't drawn open like someone would do to see out of the window, but rolled to each side, like someone would roll up a newspaper, just as if someone had been sitting in the window. I looked at that for about 30 seconds, turned out the light, walked back out, went to bed, contacts and all. The next morning, it took me a few minutes to unroll each curtain and flatten it out so it would lay flat again. Back a long time ago, there was a farmhouse, and a farmer, his wife, and son escaped a fire in the house. Also on fire was the horse stables. The farmer ran in to rescue the horses before they succumbed to the fire, while the wife and son went to wave down a train that was passing by. The story ends with the farmer dying in the stable fire, and as the wife and child were waving down the train, they were struck and killed. To this day, if you park your car under the bridge while the train crossed you above, it's supposed to open up another dimensional world to be able to communicate in. Well, we show up, and of course to our luck, there's a train coming. We all freaked out and got pumped while the medium Chris Fleming attempted to communicate. We were all taking pictures and began to experience weird technological failures. My camera began flashing and taking multiple pictures. The same thing also happened to our disposable camera that Chris Fleming's assistant had. At one point, we began to see stuff mostly out of the corner of our eyes, and Chris attempted to communicate, but whatever spirit was there seemed more intimidated. Chris believed it to be the spirit of the little boy. We would every now and then see a figure poking its head out from behind a concrete wall under the tracks. It seemed like it was playing hide and seek. Fast forward to a year or two after this event. I came to this place for the first time since that night we came with Chris Fleming. This time it was just me and my girlfriend. I parked under the bridge, turned off the car and lights, and took the key out of the ignition. We were joking together about how we were getting too old for this stuff, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw a black shadow flash by the rear window of my car by some noises that sounds like someone running towards it. My heart never raced so fast to put my key into the ignition and peel and get out of there. Whatever it was, didn't seem like it wanted us there, and I have yet to drive under or by that bridge ever since. My paternal grandmother died when I was 6. I lived in New York and she lived in Pennsylvania. I met her maybe twice. I was 6 years old, asleep in bed one night, and for whatever reason, I woke up and walked into my parents' bedroom. My father had an easy chair in one corner for reading, so I sat in it. On the opposite wall was my father's closet. It opened, and my grandmother came out and stood about 6 feet away.
"I just wanted to say goodbye," she said, smiling and waving, then turned back and walked back into the closet, closing the door behind her. I went back into my room. About 2 hours later, at about 6 a.m, the phone rings. It was a call from the PA that Grandma Catherine had died in her sleep. My mother came to wake me up to tell me, and I said, "I know." "What do you mean?" she asked. "She came to say goodbye last night. She made me repeat the story 3 times and then told me to never ever tell my father that story. And I never did." This happened in my senior year of college, Christmas break 2006. I worked for a professor that asked me to house dog sit for him while he was out of town to see a ball game that we were in. He was gone for 3 days and had a huge piece of land in the middle of nowhere, so I invited my girlfriend at the time. He had horses and fishing and a gator to ride around on, etc, etc. So the first 2 nights went down with no incident, but the last night, his little foofy dog is having a fit. She keeps barking at the back door. At first we blow it off, but decide to lock the dog inside in case of a coyote or something. After a while, we start to get a little creeped out. I keep saying it's probably an animal and we'll be fine. My girlfriend, who wasn't too bright to be honest, wants to go investigate to see what's outside, so I lock the door behind her. Just kidding. She goes outside and says she saw something small and grey, probably a coyote, and it ran off. So just an animal. No worries, but by this time, we're pretty spooked. The dog now starts barking at the window on the other side of the house. We're still trying to ignore it, but are getting a little worried. We decide to get into bed. Awkward silence. Then I hear it. It sounds like a little girl singing a soft, eerie lullaby. I don't say anything, hoping that my mind is playing tricks on me. My girlfriend says, "Let's get the fuck out of here." I say, "Why?" She says, "You didn't hear that little girl singing?" Okay, let's get the fuck out of here. We got the fuck out. I even called someone to talk to me while we walked out to my car. Coincidentally, the professor had lost a daughter when she was about 5 years old, many years ago. We moved into a new house a few months ago. As we were in the process of purchasing the house, the renter who was living in it died unexpectedly of natural causes in his mid-40s. He died right in the middle of the living room. So shortly after we moved into the house, almost immediately, our 2-year-old daughter starts talking about the ghost that lives in our house. Now let's be real here. She's 2, and 2-year-olds are very impressionable. Halloween had just recently passed, and she had this Halloween-themed picture book that she loved to read, so it was entirely possible that all this talk of ghosts was just coming through looking through that book on a regular basis. Still, she was always telling me that the ghost was in a playhouse in the basement, or that the ghost was on the stairs, or that the ghost was standing in the corner. She never seemed to be afraid of the ghost, and considered him to be a friend, so I wasn't all that concerned even if there really was a ghost haunting our house. If he's a nice and helpful ghost, it could certainly be a lot worse, like Amityville Horror worse. I would often tell the ghost that he's welcome to stay if he wanted to, but he was also welcome to go if that would make him happier. At the time, I was about 30-70 on the ghost being real, versus the ghost being just an imagination fueled by a Halloween book. Until one day, when we were going out to the car to go to daycare in the morning. It was still dark out and rainy. My daughter told me that the ghost was on the back deck, and she told me that today was the ghost's birthday, and she wanted to sing him happy birthday. Once again, I mostly disregarded what she said, as she was birthday obsessed at the time and has in the past made us sing happy birthday to Mickey Mouse, a bowl of fruit snacks, and the bathroom. So we sang, and we wished the ghost a happy birthday, and went on with our lives. Later that day, just out of pure curiosity, I looked up the obituary of the man who had died in our house. and wouldn't you know it,
It was his fucking birthday. This happened last summer. We have an old Mercury Grand Marquis that my dad had wanted to buy for years. The owner would never sell it, even though it was just left sitting there on the driveway. After the owner died, his daughter sold it to us for pretty cheap because she knew how bad my dad wanted it. So one day, I had driven it to a friend's house on a rainy day to play some Smash Brothers. I left at about 10 that night. It stopped raining and I had to drive my friend home. So this car's radio didn't work, and it would only be static if it was on anyway. Well, I turned down my friend's road, and when I turned, I heard someone say, "Get out." I know it wasn't my friend, because he was talking to me. So we continued conversation, and I got to his house about 5 minutes later. When we got there, I asked him if he heard anything weird when we turned onto the road. He said he heard the exact same thing I did, and I was freaked the fuck out. Safe to say, I haven't driven that car since. I worked the graveyard shift in a hospital kitchen about 5 years ago. Before the kitchen was renovated a few years prior, our dish room used to be part of the morgue. While I was training, I'd frequently feel like someone was watching me, especially when I crossed into that part of the hallway. Every time I went into the dish room, something would be moved, turned over, or missing. Assuming it was my co-worker, I didn't think anything of it. About a week later, my co-worker leaves and I'm left on my own. Every night, I would hear carts being moved around, dishes being put away, and silverware rattling. If I would leave for a minute, I'd get back, and my radio would be switched to a different station. It got to the point where I was terrified to come to work every night. I called my old co-worker, told her what was going on, and she very calmly said, "Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you about George." Apparently, George was a medical examiner who had a stroke and died while at work. He was in his 50s, I was told. From then on, everything actually went quite well. I introduced myself to George, asked him to please keep it down, and as long as I said hi to him as soon as I started work, he didn't seem to want to bother me anymore. It took us a little while to find a radio station we could agree on, but we worked harmoniously after that. When I left the job a year later, I made sure that I told the girl that replaced me about George. I lived in this dark, creepyish rental house from about the 4th to 7th grades. I don't know if the house was actually haunted or not, but my mum, my sister, and I always got these creepy feelings around various areas of the house, particularly the closet and the bathroom in the master bedroom. So my sister, who was a little bit younger than me, would tell me about how she saw this disembodied head of a woman floating above my bed at night and looking at me while I slept. I admit, at night, I would get that eerie feeling that something I couldn't see was watching me, but trying to be a tough 9-year-old, I brushed off what she was saying as the ramblings of a 7-year-old with a vivid imagination. Nothing really happened for months, and I even forgot about what my sister said about that disembodied head until one night when I was in a particular deep sleep. I suddenly heard the blood-curdling scream of a woman right outside my ear. At first, I thought it was my mum or my sister messing with me, but when I glanced across the room, I saw my sister sleeping in bed and went to my mum's room and saw her sleeping as well. There was no other woman in that house that could have possibly done it. I work in a warehouse that my father purchased. He bought it for 25% of its cost price from a farmer who seemed to be very excited to get rid of it. It's in the middle of Mennonite country with no neighbours for a half-mile around. Look out the window, you see cornfields and scraggly trees. Self-service? Forget about it. I work here alone, painting and preparing the front office portion for eventually functionality. To get to the front office, you must go through a hallway from the main warehouse into a secondary office, and then through another door into the front. I frequently hear bumps and thuds and occasionally will go into the warehouse and feel air movement, but I've always attributed it to drafts and animal life on the roof. The only thing that's ever made me feel uneasy about the building is the fact that all of the door locks are reversed. Whoever installed the locks didn't intend to keep people out.
they intended to keep something in. I was in the front office when I began to hear the thudding. I ignored it and continued to apply masking tape to the door I was working on. But this time, it was accompanied by a screeching sound. Not loud, but audible. I was freaked out, but convinced myself that it was just a pissed off raccoon or squirrel that had found its way inside. I continued working until I heard the slam. The door to the secondary office had been open. It sounded like it had violently slammed shut. I peeked around the corner and saw that I was right. The secondary door was now closed. I tried to logic it through in my head that a strong draft had sucked it closed, although I knew there was no such draft. The thudding then began again, close this time. I've never been able to put proximity on it, but now it sounded like it was right on the other side of the door. I froze, unsure of what was happening. My eyes locked on the door handle, which began to turn. The door disengaged its latch and slowly swung open. Wider. Wider. Nothing there. Nothing inside, nothing visible, no air movement, just quiet. So quiet. A quiet that seemed to overwhelm me with its presence. A quiet so thick I couldn't breathe. The quiet was shattered when the screech came again. This time, it was clearly human. Pained, angered, and emanating from the main warehouse. The door slammed. That entirely broke my frozen, fearful state. I ran. I got in my car and drove until I was in cell range to call my father. He didn't believe anything about the doors closing, but agreed that the building had something weird about it. He told me he'd be right out. So fast forward half an hour, my dad and I met up and drove back to the warehouse. I showed him the door that slammed, showing him that it was separated from the front office and the main warehouse, so no draft could have closed it. I told him about the thuds, the screeching, and the sudden quiet that overcame the building. He decided that we should check the main warehouse. Emboldened by his presence, I led the way. Something you should know about the warehouse. It was formerly a furniture manufacturing place owned by a Mennonite farmer. They made homemade chairs, tables, etc. Because of all the cutting that went on, the floor is thickly coated with dust. We walked into the warehouse and saw nothing out of the ordinary. The dust was untouched, the doors were closed, the windows were locked. The only thing out of the ordinary was one of the hanging fluorescent light fixtures. It was hanging askew and swaying slightly. Insisting we take a look at the mount to ensure it didn't break loose, my dad grabbed a stepladder. He supported it while I climbed up and grabbed the swinging light. I looked on top of the light and saw a handprint. A single fresh, inhumanly large handprint. No footprints in the dust around the light. No signs of a presence. I climbed down and switched places with my father. He saw it and said, "What the hell? There's been no one in here for years." He climbed down and told me he had suspicion of someone breaking in and stealing parts from the warehouse light system. He couldn't believe me that this wasn't human, that something wasn't right here. The last thing he said is, "Nothing is here. Next time, just go back to work." And then, as if to show its presence, the thud returned. This time it wasn't just a thud, but more of an earthquake. The entire building felt like it moved. The heartbeat-like thud was then overlaid by the screech. The awful, fucking awful screech. It felt like it was coming from the walls themselves, and we ran. I haven't returned. My father hired someone to finish my job and has since moved into the office. He's heard the thudding, but thus far nothing has happened further. I'll never forget the sound of that lock turning by itself, or the feeling of the deafening silence. My friend and I were going to a party a few hours out of town, so we decided to stay at a family's holiday house about an hour south of the party, now 3 hours from home. We arrived around mid-afternoon, and it was winter in a holiday town, so the area was completely empty.
no other cars on the street. When we left for the party, I spent a moment deciding whether to pull the gate all the way closed. I'd had some trouble opening it earlier when we arrived, and if we were getting home late at night, I didn't want to be stuck outside, but I decided to shut it for security. The party was great. We got back to the house around 12:30 and the gate was open. I immediately felt on edge because not only did I know I'd locked it, but I knew it couldn't just blow open in the wind. I didn't want to make a big deal about it, so I was vague when my friend asked if I'd shut it. We went inside and decided to make a snack. I was wandering through the house when suddenly my friend raced from the kitchen into the hallway and virtually tackled me to the ground. She was convinced she heard someone walking around outside. We tried to calm ourselves down, but we had no cell reception and there was no one else around. Over the next half hour or so, as we sat in the hallway paralysed with fear, we heard footsteps outside and the back door being jimmied. We decided we had to leave, so we gathered everything and got ready to make a break for the car. Just as we were at the front door, ready to leave, there was a huge bang in the backyard, and suddenly what sounded like hundreds of birds started screaming. We legged it to the car, ended up starting it with all our stuff still in our laps, and we hadn't bothered to even put it in the back seat. As we reversed out of the driveway, we saw someone running up the side of the house towards us. We sped the entire way home, and even once we got back to my place, didn't sleep at all that night. Obviously we called police. There was no signs of any damage or footprints around that house. When my son was about 3, he had an imaginary friend in his room who we used to talk to all the time. He would tell us stories about the things she would tell him, and we'd hear him chatting to her at bedtime. We thought it was pretty cute. After a few months, my son said he wasn't friends with her anymore. We figured he was over this phase of seeing her, so we were surprised to hear him still talking to her at night. Then he started not wanting to go to bed and having really bad dreams. At some point, we ended up asking a lot of questions about her. We assumed she was a little girl, but apparently she was 47. She lived in the wall, and he stopped being friends with her because she wanted him to call her mummy. She wanted him to come and live in the wall with her. He told her he didn't want to talk to her anymore because she wouldn't go away. We eventually moved house, and he stopped talking about her. The funny thing is, when I was pregnant with him, I used to have dreams about a lady sitting at a dining table in our bedroom, except it was obviously a different era, and the room was not a bedroom at the time. The lady used to knit and make me listen to her giving me parenting advice, while her two 20-ish-year-old sons sat at the table quietly. When I was a child, we would frequently get calls for a woman named Tanya. It didn't seem like a big deal. She had the same last name as us, although it's quite a common one around here. When we moved across the city, phone books stopped being the go-to thing for finding somebody's number, so the calls for Tanya gradually stopped. Those days seemed to have ended and we carried on, forgetting about this mysterious Tanya. It was about 4 years ago that she popped into our lives again. I was driving home from work one afternoon and was greeted by a pretty grisly car wreck at the turn to my house. 2 cars had collided, and one had wrapped itself around the signage pole that had house numbers and directions on it, one of which was my house number. Several days later, we get a call from the police. They asked if Tanya was at this residence. Her car was found wrapped around a pole down the street from my house, and she was nowhere to be found at the accident site. If you like the video so far, please give it a thumbs up and let me know what you think in the comments below. And now for the final story of this video. When I was younger, my family was extremely poor and lived in a very old mobile home on some land my grandpa owned. This piece of land was in a very small town out in the middle of nowhere, Texas, and was covered in woods. The town itself was your typical small country town where football was king and there was nothing to do but get drunk or high on the weekend. It was also the type of town, along with it being the early 90s, where one didn't typically have to worry too much about locking their doors or setting an alarm. Now, our trailer was a 2-bedroom, and my parents, always putting us kids ahead of themselves, slept in the living room on a fold-out couch. My room was directly connected to it, and my sister's room was down a hallway past the kitchen and bathroom at the other end of the trailer. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, my dad's woken up by a feeling that there's someone in the room. He looks around a bit, and then sees a large male figure sitting in the easy chair just feet from the bed. My dad quickly flipped on the light switch next to his bed and saw it was a neighbour from down the road named Carter. Carter was known to be a frequent drug user and was often in trouble with the law because of this. My dad asked him what the fuck he was doing here and told him to get out. Carter responded, "I can't get out. The demons are chasing me and your house is the only safe one." My dad, who I should say is fairly large and a terrifying person, responded that if he didn't get out, and get out quickly, that the house would be a lot less safe for him. Carter responded, "If I leave, they'll get me. They've been chasing me all night. If they catch me, I'm dead." My dad's response was that there was no demons, but that if he didn't get the fuck out of his house, that he'd be dead. From what I've been told, since I was asleep for this part, my mum also held a few threats, and while she may not be as big, she was equally as terrifying. I believe it was her anger that finally scared him off. After Carter left, my dad got up and locked the door, but watched him through the blinds. Carter decided, since he couldn't outrun the demons, he'd steal our old beater Suburban that my dad always left the keys in. Carter drove around for about an hour. We called the police in the meantime, and it took them about that long to get out to us since the closest police station was about 20 or 30 minutes away. He finally brought it back and was arrested and taken to jail. Apparently he was deemed crazy and ended up locked in a mental institution. Not long after, we started getting phone calls where all we'd hear is music that would have lyrics like, "I'm going to fucking kill you." These calls lasted for years and followed us from house to house, even though we always had different numbers and would even be in different states. We always thought it was Carter sending us a message. I later found out that the call started occurring after Carter thought the best thing he could do for himself was to soak himself in gasoline and set himself on fire.